As you were saying, I think one of the biggest takeaways from today is not actually from the autumn statement document itself, but the Office for Budget Responsibility forecasts. A world of pain for people, a sort of pinch, a vice that people are moving into economically, where they just will not have the same disposable income as they've known. And the dip in income is of a kind that many will not have had lived experience of in their adult lives. And that's going to have an enormous impact on all the other numbers that are churning around at the moment, like how deep the recession goes. I think one of the other big takeaways here is in the autumn statement document itself. When you're looking for the tough measures and you're looking for when they're going to be implemented, don't waste too much time on the first two columns this year, the coming year, the year after. Look beyond there to year 3, year 4, year 5, and those, funnily enough, happen to be the other side of a general election. But what the government is saying is that isn't why they've been shoved over to that column. It's that they don't want to exacerbate the recession that we were just talking about. But there's an awful lot of scepticism that there's some politics involved in that as well, a lot of politics. And boy, did we see a lot of politics today. It really isn't a very long time at all since Kwasi Kwarteng walked along there and announced a very different type of approach to the economy. And what we today got from Jeremy Hunt, working very much hand in hand with Rishi Sunak, is a complete reversal of what he and Kwasi Kwarteng and Liz Truss were trying to do. What they produced today was exactly the kind of anti-growth coalition centrist politics that they disparaged. They moved their tax onto Labour's lawn, and I think one of the big takeaways you come away with on the politics of all of this is that so soon after that very alternative, radical right approach, today, a very strong whiff of the politics of Gordon Brown. 2 months after Kwasi Kwarteng walked out of this door and announced the biggest tax giveaway for 50 years, his replacement, Tory Chancellor Jeremy Hunt, announced £55 billion of tax rises and spending cuts.
Jeremy Hunt!
The Chancellor said it was necessary to show the markets that this government was responsible.
British families make sacrifices every day to live within their means, and so too must their government, because the United Kingdom will always pay its way. Yeah. I understand the motivation of my predecessor's mini-budget, and he was correct. He was correct to identify growth as a priority. But unfunded tax cuts are as risky as unfunded spending.
The majority of the tax raising is done by freezing thresholds for even longer than Rishi Sunak had already planned, right up to 2028. Over time, it'll mean millions are dragged into tax bans they otherwise would have avoided.
Although my decisions today do lead to a substantial tax increase, we have not raised headline rates of taxation, and tax as a percentage of GDP will increase by just 1% over the next 5 years.
That takes it to a post-war record high as a percentage of GDP. But the bulk of the tax rises and the spending cuts are booked for the years after the general election.
Hi, I'm Jeremy. Hi.
Before then, Jeremy Hunt is adding some spending for schools and health budgets.
My daughters are in primary school.
He's also continuing with Liz Truss's energy bill cap, though at a higher £3,000 rate, adding some additional targeted help.
It shows that you don't need to choose either a strong economy or good public services. With Conservatives, and only with Conservatives, you get both. And I commend this statement to the House.
Some Tory MPs said Jeremy Hunt had successfully laid a trap for Labour. Would they back his projected spending cuts? Had he stolen their most plausible tax rises?
Because of Tory failure, our crumbling public services are set to suffer even more. Ordinary people lose yet again. Never before have people paid so much in tax and yet got so little in return.
The independent economic forecaster, the Office for Budget Responsibility, silenced under Liz Truss, was allowed to publish its economic assessment. It made very gloomy reading. The story of the post-war era has been real household disposable income going up, with occasional dips, especially after the banking crisis in 2008. Today, the Office for Budget Responsibility forecast 2 consecutive years of falling income. Put together, they'd amount to a 7% drop, the worst decline in 6 decades.
If we really do see falls in our income of 7%, and remember that is after a long period of very poor income growth, that's going to feel
wiping
tough.
out a decade of growth.
Wiping out a decade of poor growth, very poor earnings growth over this period. That's why we are feeling a cost of living crisis. That's what we mean by a cost of living crisis. It looks pretty grim if that's where we end up.
The government raised the state pension and universal credit in line with inflation. Most pain is deferred, and Tory political strategy is yet again changing shape.
The Treasury has certainly tried to set people's expectations and then bring forward a package that is less painful maybe than they've been saying to people in recent weeks, partly because the spending cuts are delayed till after the next election, benefit increases, and may or may not happen, and then the welfare increases are going ahead, and the pension increase in April, and the tax cuts that are happening are largely for the top half of the income distribution. So
and stealth taxes.
And they're very stealthy because
Classic
they may...
Gordon Brown.
Yeah, this whole package is the rhetoric of George Osborne dressed up with the policy of Gordon Brown.
56 days after Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng lurched their party to the right with the mini-budget, Jeremy Hunt and Rishi Sunak have returned to more centrist economics. But if the forecasts are right, their strategic shift may be overwhelmed by the economic pain ahead.
Well, Jeremy Hunt cast today's autumn statement as a plan to rebuild the economy. But unlike the mini-budget delivered by his predecessor, his announcement was accompanied by forecasts from the Independent Office for Budget Responsibility. And they are predicting a recession, rising unemployment and hundreds of billions in more borrowing. Our economics reporter, Neil MacDonald, is with me now. So, how bad is the outlook for the economy?
Well, the economy is now heading into a recession that's already started, according to the OBR, driven by this unprecedented collapse in people's disposable incomes, mainly due to, of course, the very high rate of inflation, the high rate of gas prices. To give you a sense of what's coming, if the OBR is correct, then by 2024, people's disposable incomes will have gone back to the level they were in 2013. So that is a decade of increases in people's living standards wiped out. And this is the big change, really, in how the OBR sees things since the spring. So if you go back to March, what they were expecting for the next 3 years was economic growth of around about 2%, solid, not spectacular. Now they think that next year there will be a big fall in output, weaker growth again the year after, but a bit of a recovery after that. One consequence of all that, by the way, unemployment probably up about 500,000.
Right, and things get better after that?
Well, there's a bit of a bounce back, providing international gas prices come down a bit, inflation falls as expected. Of course, neither of those two things are guaranteed. I think what's striking about the forecast today is what there isn't really any sense of is at the end of all this, somehow there's a dramatic improvement in our long-term economic prospects. So today the OBR published some figures showing that in the 10 years before the financial crash, our economy was growing by about 2.7% a year. In the 10 years since 2010, that falls to about 2% a year, and from 2023, they think the economy is going to be growing slower again by about 1.75% a year. Now, a lot of economists think that it's these long-term growth rates that really dictate our living standards and also how easy it is to pay for public services. So if today's statement was meant to be a plan to rebuild our economy, there's certainly not much evidence for that in these forecasts.
OK, and what does all this mean for the much-debated black hole?
Yeah, if you were worried about the black hole, some economists weren't, but if you were, the good news is it has been filled by all these tax increases and spending cuts, but only just. So this is the fiscal rule that the government has, which it says helps to control government debts long term. And their objective is for total government debt to fall as a share of our national income. And these latest figures today from the OBR show that that does happen right at the end of the forecast period. Some viewers may struggle to see what happens because it's a very small fall in 5 years' time. In fact, we managed to fall with a margin of error of £9 billion. And it's worth bearing in mind that, of course, total national debts are more like £2.9 trillion. So it wouldn't take very much for that margin of error to be wiped out. And also just very quickly to remember, this is about bringing down debt as a share of our national income. It doesn't mean that national debt isn't in fact going up in cash terms, and it is, by £420 billion.
Neil MacDonald, thank you. Fatima.
So how have today's announcements been received? In a moment, we'll be hearing from our policy correspondent, Paul McNamara, about how businesses have responded to the increased tax burdens they face. But first, the Chancellor, who is of course a former health secretary, said today that he wanted a health service offering Scandinavian-style quality alongside Singaporean levels of efficiency, as he announced more money for the NHS in England. Well, I'm joined by our health and social care editor, Victoria MacDonald. Victoria, how's it gone down?
Well, a broad welcome, I would say, but quite muted. £3.3 billion for the NHS in England for each of the next 2 years. So that was more than many had feared would be given, less than we were told was needed. So it will take care, it's hoped, of the priorities, and we know what those are really: A&E waiting times, ambulance handovers, some of the staffing issues, that though probably not nearly enough for that. And then it also depends on what happens with social care. Again, there was a welcome because there was more money for social care, but that will depend partly on council tax rises, and there was deep concern, deep frustration, I would say, at the kicking the reforms of social care down the lane for another 2 years. What they are most concerned about, the analysts looking at this, is what they're going to do with staffing right now. Now, there will be a plan put together by a former Health Secretary, Patricia Hewitt. She's going to be asked to look at what the needs will be for the next 5, 10 and 15 years. But today, the Royal College of Nursing upped the ante, if you like, and said if they don't get round the negotiating table, if the government doesn't get round the negotiating table within the next 5 days, the RCN will announce its strike dates for December.
Plenty of problems down the line then. Paul, give us a flavour of the business reaction.
Well, the big headline grabber is the increase of 10% in the windfall tax for oil and gas firms. That and some other energy taxes. The government said going to bring about £14 billion next year. Away from energy, though, businesses are in for some big tax rises. Now, the Chancellor tried to soften the blow of this. There's some relief on business rates. That's worth about £13 billion. And that has been welcomed. But in general, the major business groups have got some issues with today's statement. So the biggest one for them is the freeze of the national insurance, of the threshold at which national insurance contributions are paid by employers. The CBI called this the sting in the tail of the statement. So it might not feel like it right now in real terms, but wages are creeping up. With the national insurance contribution threshold staying where it is, more people are being dragged into that realm where businesses have to pay more. The government says it's going to raise them about £5 billion. Businesses say, yes, us is going to pay it.
And just quickly, what about energy support for businesses?
Yes, that's staying, but until March, and then most of them are going to lose it. That's a major concern. There's some other concerns as well. You know, ultimately, businesses say, look, we get it. The finances are in a tough space right now. We have to pay more taxes. You know, I spoke to veteran advertising boss Sir Martin Sorrell earlier on. He said the government's made the best of a bad job. Then he goes on to add, though, if there was a growth plan in there to inspire business confidence once we're over the hump in 2 years' time, I didn't hear it. British Chamber of Commerce went even further. They said this statement will not increase business confidence.
Astonishing. Paul, Victoria, thank you both very much. Krish.
Thanks, Fatima. Well, the Chancellor has been very clear about the need to be honest with the public about the scale of the challenge. So when I spoke to the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, John Glenn, we discussed whether today's budget is equally honest in its measures. I began by asking how much money it's raising from freezing tax thresholds, that policy known as fiscal drag.
Well, the tax decisions and the spending decisions are about equal. About 27 billion each, and we've set out all of those decisions today. There's obviously some business taxes and some taxes that are on individuals, and we've been very clear. We have held those allowances for another 2 years beyond what the Prime Minister had when he was Chancellor, and we've done that to raise more taxes. I'm not.
So in 2 years, what do you raise from fiscal drag?
Well, I can't give you the precise number, but what I'm trying to say is that we've been very clear that this will hit people in terms of the increased tax that they're paying. And the Chancellor was, I think, pretty clear that that was the case.
Right, but the Chancellor also said that you have a duty as Conservatives not to pass on debts to the next generation.
Yes, and that's
but you
why,
are, aren't you?
Well, that's why at the end of the period, the 5-year period, we'll see debt falling as a percentage of GDP.
But how much higher will debt at the end of 5 years be than it is now?
Well, what we've got to be clear about is that
hundreds of billions, isn't it? That's the truth.
Well, look, 3 years ago, when we came into government, we didn't expect to face a situation where 4 or 5 months later we shut down the economy overnight.
Fine, but why say you're not going to pass debt on to the next generation when you are passing on £400 billion worth of debt over the space of 5 years?
We are in a situation when we have inflation at 11%. We haven't had that for 40 years. These are pretty unique circumstances. Following the COVID legacy, a level of debt. Most people understand that the furlough payments involved a level of borrowing that we haven't seen for many generations. To be followed.
But you are handing on debt to the next generation, aren't you?
The debt profile set out in the document, as you say, we are not going to clear debt overnight. I think people will understand that. What we've got to try and do, though, is make sure that we take decisions that support the most vulnerable compassionately through these next 2 years, and actually continue to invest in capital projects, in infrastructure. We've got record levels of investment in infrastructure so that we can grow the economy.
Of this 55 billion, how much of it is the hangover from the last mini-budget, Kwasi Kwarteng's budget? I mean, there was the national insurance and stamp duty tax cuts. That was about 20 billion or so.
Well, I think when the Chancellor came in, 3 days later, he reversed the substantive elements of the budget.
But those things stayed.
Today he's addressed the challenges in terms of stamp duty and when he's going to sunset that and end that support to try and ensure that we put the best conditions for recovery across the economy. I fully accept that the decisions made in the mini budget on the 23rd of September was a mistake.
But what did they cost? You know, because people are looking at these numbers and they're thinking, it looks like that cost about £30 billion. That's what the Resolution Foundation say. And we're looking at £30 billion of spending cuts. There's a direct correlation between what we're going to lose in public services and that disastrous mini-budget.
I think most people understand that the level of debt that we have in this country is primarily driven by the costs incurred from COVID and also the impact that we've had from the inflation. Yeah. So that's why we've made tough decisions about the way that we're going to spend money going forward. We have invested in R&D. We've made considerations for small businesses. We've made sure that in terms of business rates reliefs, we've made sure that corporation tax, though it's still competitive, the best in the G7, the smallest businesses won't pay it. We have made those interventions so that we can actually lay the conditions for growth in the economy.
Right, but this is all contingent on nurses and teachers and care workers all taking massive real terms pay cuts. Well, are you really looking them in the eyes and say, you've got to pay for this?
Well, as you know, each pay settlement is done through a pay board that takes evidence from employers, from employees and trade unions, etc.
And the reality is pay cuts, isn't it?
And the reality is that we as a government usually accept those the advice from those pay boards.
And that is pay cuts.
In the same way they accepted the increase in the national living wage today.
So you're going into the next election saying, we cut your pay, we raise your taxes to historic levels not seen since the Second World War, you're getting less for it in your public services because we're going to cut public spending. Vote Conservative.
My challenge as the government minister, as Chief Secretary to Treasury, working closely with the Chancellor, is to do whatever I can to tackle inflation, to put in the conditions for growth, and to be compassionate in supporting public services through one of the most challenging periods they will ever face.
John Glenn, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So how will the government's plans for such a high tax burden go down with their own backbenchers? Yesterday, there was a glimpse of the discontent brewing when former Minister Esther McVey threatened to vote against the government if the HS2 rail project wasn't axed. And it wasn't. Joining me now is Jacob Rees-Mogg, who served in the cabinets of both Boris Johnson and Liz Truss, but has now returned to the backbenches. Good evening. How do you feel about going into the next election defending the biggest tax burden since the Second World War?
Well, it's not something that I'm in favour of. I think the Conservative Party should ensure that taxing the country and the expenditure match at a reasonable level, and taxation has got too high, and there are issues with the levels of expenditure that we've currently got.
Which measures would you oppose out of those that were announced today?
I think there is a real problem with fiscal drag, bringing more and more people into the 40p band who, particularly if they're living in the south of England, are not necessarily particularly well off, and that is going to be hard for them, paying an extra level of tax on top of what they're already paying. But also freezing the basic band is going to be a burden for all taxpayers, even those who are still in receipt of benefits.
There was a big group of your colleagues who wrote to the Chancellor the night before the budget, demanding things like, freeze on fuel duty. Are you with them? I mean, are you threatening anything? Is there any sort of or else, or are you just expressing discontent?
No, I'm not threatening anything. I'm simply making the case for conservatism. I would have liked to have heard from the Chancellor that they're carrying on with the plans to reduce the civil service by 91,000 to save several £billion. I think it's very important that the money spent by taxpayers is spent well. I'm concerned by the size of the infrastructure budget, and I would like assurances that that money is going to be spent well, because we've certainly seen with HS2 enormous overruns in the cost, and that has to be paid for. So can we be certain that costs are properly under control? I'm concerned that the NHS, while receiving extra expenditure and having extra doctors and extra nurses, is carrying out fewer procedures. So I think we need to look at the efficiency of government to make sure money is well spent before reaching for the easy option of putting up taxes.
They might say it's your fault, though, for encouraging the Kwarteng Trust budget that proved to be so reckless and so costly. I mean, is it your fault?
Well, I would dispute your choice of language. I wouldn't put so much weight on the forecasts of the ABR as currently being put on them, because they were out from October of last year to March of last year by £50 billion in their forecast of the deficit. They said inflation would be 4% in 2022 and would peak at 4.4%. So what I'm concerned about is that we are setting our tax policy on forecasts that have historically been wildly inaccurate, and that what we actually need to be doing is having a strategy for growth and looking to lower taxes. I think it's a great pity that we are going to higher corporation tax, because actually lower rates of corporation tax raised more money, and therefore there was more money for public services and more growth and more companies wanting to invest in the United Kingdom.
Is it time for you to perhaps rethink the whole Brexit question? I mean, there is now mounting surety in the OBR that Brexit is a 15% lag, or has a 15% impact on trade intensity with Europe. We know that that figure of a 4% impact on GDP is one that they still hold to. I mean, that's been the other factor, isn't it, that nobody wants to talk about, that since Brexit growth has been low, it's not gone well.
I would encourage people to read an excellent article by Oliver Wright in the Times today that pointed out that the ABR's scare stories on Brexit are just wrong, and it's got its figures wrong, as it's got its figures wrong on so many of its forecasts. Brexit is a huge opportunity for supply-side reforms. That's what the Chancellor was talking about. The one positive thing of his budget was talking about the supply-side reforms, getting billions of pounds into the economy by dealing with Solvency II and issues like that. So there are huge opportunities there, getting rid of some of the 2,400 laws from the EU that make us inefficient.
Have you seen today's
poll? We must really be getting on with that.
I mean, it suggests that people have changed their minds.
Well, we had a referendum, and this is a bit like the Scottish question. Those of you who lost, and I include you in that category after your comments to Steve Baker, those of you who lost are very determined to have another referendum. You're just like Nicola Sturgeon, quite honestly.
Well, we'll leave that for another conversation. My comments had nothing to do with politics or policy, I assure you.
Have you apologised for them online? Do you want to apologise on the air for them? Because I think that's important. Good.
I have apologised, Mr Rees-Mogg, and he's accepted.
Oh, good. That's important.
Now, I want to talk to you about the budget and Rishi Sunak. You've told me many times that Mr Sunak was a very bad Chancellor. How do you think he's going as a Prime Minister?
I'm a Conservative Member of Parliament and I support the leader of the party. We've had 3 leaders in the last few months. It would be ridiculous to have another, and therefore people like me have a duty in the interests of the country and the party to support our leader.
Do you think he's a good Prime Minister?
I'm supporting the Prime Minister.
That's not a yes, but Jacob Rees-Mogg, thank you very much.
Well, he's only been in the job 3 weeks. Thank you.
All right, thank you.